All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Office Hours, where we answer questions, give philosophical perspectives, formulate and explore arguments, and deep dive into particular topics of your choice. Ian writes, how much of what we are seeing in art is primed by our personal projection of what we think we are seeing? It seems like any elements of a scene that allows us to wander into imagination or heightened reality separates us further from what is actually occurring, so that we need to project to feel some sort of grounding. I love this question tremendously. This is it's a big part of my own worldview, to be honest. Perception and priming is a huge field of study in not just psychology but also epistemology. Um, and the influence of priming on perception, and we'll get to the art part of this a little bit later, is really difficult to underestimate. Um, I feel like I've been getting a kind of persistent 3 year continuing education in this, listening to Scott Adams, who you might know as the cartoonist behind Dilbert, but he's also a writer on success, business, mindset stuff, because he is a trained hypnotist and a persuader, and he writes a lot about hypnotism and brainwashing, persuasion, and that kind of thing. That also has a lot to do with priming and perception. We'll get to that a little bit more later as well. But before I started following Scott Adams, I got a little bit of an education in this from the world of stage magic. And stage magic and familiarity with how stage magic works was very influential in my religious thinking. And I'm kind of going all over the place here, but to bring this into perspective, let me allow me to read a section of my book on the subject, Holy Nihilism, which is my argument against Christianity, specifically as it pertained to my experience of hearing the voice of God. I won't read the whole extended section because it's kind of long for a video like this, but when I was in high school, I started reading not just Christian books, but also atheist books. And like Richard Dawkins was really big at the time, and people were reading Sam Harris and people were reading Christopher Hitchens. But the book that stood out to me the most was a book by a guy named Dan Barker called Godless. Now, Dan Barker's an interesting character because he was a former pastor, and he described having this experience where he heard the voice of God telling him to drive down this particular road. He was like, okay. And he followed what the voice of God told him to do. And he drove down this road, and the voice of God told him to park. So he pulled in, and he parked at this cul-de-sac, this dead end, and he sat there for 4 hours waiting. And eventually he's like, I don't think this is correct. Was that really the voice of God that told me to do that? And he eventually concluded that it wasn't. And it was a very personal thing for me to read because I had experienced something very similar. I won't go into details about my own humorous and embarrassing, socially embarrassing episode with this. You'll have to read the book to find out. But basically, I had a similar experience where I thought God was telling me to do something. I did that. It didn't turn out very well. And I had this sense that, like, surely this could not have been actually the voice of God for it to have gone so badly. Right? Um, and it caused me to really introspect a little bit on what I thought I was interpreting to be that voice of God. And I'll read you my conclusion. This is what I wrote in 2019, 2020. I'll have to check the date. The voice I heard was not God. It was not even a voice in the sense one might describe a schizophrenic hearing voices, disconnected audio hallucinations. What I was hearing were my own thoughts. A thought would arise that aligned with my readings of scripture or my prayers, and in my head, I would retroactively give credit to God for that thought, thinking it was His voice I was hearing. Having been taught to speak to God and look for His answers, and having spoken with many others who claimed to have heard God's voice, I simply latched on to the nearest thing, a thought, and ascribed it to God. I could not see the mental process at the time, but it is obvious to me now. End quote. So in other words, all of this talk of listening to God's voice and hearing God's voice and paying attention to God's voice and describing other people who've heard God's voice and God, we really felt like we were being guided towards doing this, or we really think God was put it on our hearts to do that. You hear that so many times, you begin to think, well, that could happen to me too, and what would that look like? And then, when you read the Bible, God's voice has its own tone that you develop in your head, right? Maybe it's Morgan Freeman, or maybe it's Mel Gibson, or whoever's voice you ascribe to God. Maybe it's Val Kilmer or whatever. If you're listening to the Prince of Egypt, and you'll hear thoughts in your head, and if they kind of vaguely align with things that you would hear in the Bible, which if you read the Bible a lot, that will populate in your head, then you'll hear it in your head in God's voice. And when you hear that, because you've been primed to interpret it that way, you will, in real time, hear it as God. And you'll think that you are hearing the voice of God. And this is entirely normal. This is not crazy people doing this. This is very, very normal people having this experience. And I might not have been able to put this together had I not been familiarized with the philosophy of stage magic. So what is magic? I mean, there's a million different directions you can go with this, but we're not talking about some weird Aleister Crowley stuff here. We're talking about stage magic. We're talking about Penn and Teller. We're talking about that kind of stuff. And there's an excellent TED Talk I'd recommend you watch if you're interested in the subject by Lawrence Hass. And Lawrence Hass defines magic in the following way. He says, magic is, quote, the artful performance of impossible things that generate energy, delight, and wonder. Now, it's not a perfect definition, obviously. Magic is a bit like comedy in that it can be kind of hard to pin down in a definition. There might even be some crossover there, but I think it does a very good job of conveying the spirit of the experience we're describing. The artful performance of the impossible that generates energy, delight, and wonder. So this sort of begs the question, how does one perform impossible things? Should be impossible by definition, right? But it's about the more precise technical definition that would kind of ruin the experience would be the artful performance of the appearance of impossible things that generates energy, delight, and wonder, right? Because nothing that is done is impossible by definition. So to do impossible things, you have to fool people into thinking that they are seeing something other than what is actually happening. And the way magicians do this is through priming. They tell people what they are about to see, and then they do something else, something that looks similar to what they were expecting to see, but is in fact different. And you can accomplish the effect through, really it's a combination of three things, I would say. There's the priming, which we've covered. This is telling them what they are about to see. What you are about to see is a man catch a bullet in his teeth. Um, Two is distraction. That is holding their attention in one place while the important things go on somewhere else. Classical stage magic shows, there's often very pretty, scantily clad women, which do a very good job of distracting things. There's lots of movement that draws our eyes, right? There's all kinds of ways to distract people. You can tell people to do a difficult mental task, and that can be extremely effective at distraction. There's a very famous psychology experiment. You can go on YouTube and check this out, where I'll plot spoil it a little bit, but it doesn't ruin the effect, I don't think. Psychology students are asked to watch a video of 5 or 6 people in a circle, and they're all dribbling basketballs. Like there's like 2 or 3 basketballs that are being dribbled around this circle, and the psychology students are asked to count the number of dribbles. When there's 5 people dribbling 2 or 3 basketballs, you have to pay close attention. And so the psychology students are watching, and they're tallying up, they're counting, they're trying to track in their head, watching the basketballs. And in the middle of the episode, a man in a gorilla suit walks slowly across the middle of the screen, right to the center of the people dribbling, turns to face the camera, does one of these numbers, and just keeps walking. Not fast, plain as day, most obvious thing in the world. Almost every student misses it. They completely don't see the gorilla because they're distracted, right? And finally, and this is important, maybe not as important as the first two, but simulation. You want the thing that you're actually doing in the magic performance to appear to be like the thing that you've primed them to expect to see. So the effectiveness of magic, if you've seen a magic show, is the evidence of how profoundly what we are primed to see influences what we see. And the neurology of this, or the psychology of this, is that perception, which we think of as just like what we see, but it isn't just sense data. Perception is the sense data and how we interpret that sense data. And Jordan Peterson, I think he was borrowing from another scientist, but I don't remember who he was referencing. But when he describes, and for all the critical things we might say about Jordan Peterson, he is very good on the psychology and on the science side, the history of psychology. Very, very worth listening to. Very much knows his stuff. And I think he's correct on the psychology of perception when he says if you're walking through the woods and you see a bear, what you perceive is not, oh, I see a large brown fuzzy thing, and then you're like, that must be a bear. What your brain jumps to is it sees a category first. It sees threat, and it's like, what does threat look like? That's like a conceptual category, right? How could we be perceiving threat before we identify the animal that we would classify as a threat? But that really is the order that we see it in. And that is because the interpretation of our sense data doesn't happen like after we see things. It happens as we are seeing things. As we are seeing the magician like do something and wind up with a bullet in his mouth, we in real time imagine that we are seeing him catch the bullet. When we hear a thought in our head that's vaguely Bible-like, and we say it in the right voice in our head, we don't say, that must be the voice of God. We hear it as God's voice in real time. And if we hear someone call, for example, Nazis and white supremacists very fine people, after we have been told that the person saying that sentence is sympathetic to those people, we'll interpret it literally and directly in real time. And we will believe that we heard someone say that, even if he said, in fact, the exact opposite. Which sort of brings me to the political side of this. And this is doesn't feel like magic, doesn't fall under Lawrence Hass's definition of magic, because it's not like energy, awe, and wonder and whatever, but it is a lot of energy. But the way that political propaganda works is actually very similar to magic. It's a lot of priming. It's a lot of repetition and association, and it's a lot of here's a disturbing new trend that you need to keep your eyes out for. That's trying to give you an interpretive lens in advance of something they're hoping you haven't been familiar with yet. So calling Trump, for example, literally Hitler for like 8 years straight, or would have been like 4 years, 3 or 4 years at the time that Charlottesville happened. And then he comes up and he says, speaking of the debate around the statue of Robert E. Lee, and there were some people who wanted to keep it and there were some people who wanted to take it down. Trump gets up and says, there are very fine people on both sides of this argument. And he immediately says, and I'm not talking about the white nationalists. Those people are awful. They need to be condemned absolutely. That's close to verbatim. He said it in that like back-to-back way. He said there are fine people on both sides, referring to this debate about the statue. People who wanted to keep it, people who wanted to get rid of it. And I'm not talking about the white nationalists. But because half the country had been primed to see anything Trump said through the lens of a Nazi sympathizer, their brain filled in the blanks and blocked out certain things. They literally couldn't hear the second part. It was like an inverse hallucination caused by cognitive dissonance. And so they literally heard with their own ears, they think, him call white nationalists and Nazis very fine people. So that's the principle of magic, the principle of priming and perception at work in politics. And it's universal. This is not just affecting liberals and Democrats, although it is kind of affecting them more at the moment. It'll be coming for conservatives too soon. Don't worry. So what about art specifically? Because that was Ian's question. How much of what we're seeing in art is primed in this way? Well, what has become one of my favorite interesting examples of this, my good friend Jack Donovan has brought this up when we've discussed art. I think it was specifically mentioned in one or maybe two of our podcasts. He brings up this example of this interesting work of art by English artist Damien Hirst. It was from the early 90s. And the work is just a large taxidermied tiger shark floating in a formaldehyde solution. And you're like, okay, it's a taxidermied shark. Like, there's all kinds of taxidermied animals. It's like a kind of an ambitious taxidermy job, a little bit more so than like a marmot or something. But the art is in the title. And the title of this work by Damien Hirst is The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living. And then, so you read that title, and then you look back at the work of art, this tiger shark that's dead, it's taxidermied, it's floating in formaldehyde. But it looks different now. The title changes how you see this taxidermied shark. It's a very strange feeling. Um, and there, all of the art is in the priming. Like the priming is the art. And what's crazy about that one is you can see the effect of the priming in real time, and you can see it working on yourself, and it doesn't have any less effect, which is mind blowing. It's a very meta, very modern artwork, but is no less cool. And the principle applies in other works of art as well, just maybe not quite as intensely. And I mean, when we're appreciating a work of art, we do bring our own biases and associations to our experience of it. But I believe what distinguishes like truly great art from a normal work is that it appeals to and captures our biases en masse. It speaks to universal experiences and universal associations. Chuck Palahniuk, the author of Fight Club and Doomed and Adjustment Day and many others, described as a part of his writing process, he would go to house parties and just in casual conversation with people, and he'd share little snippets of stories that he was kind of play testing, working on. And if a story he told generated responses from the people he were telling him to, where they would say, "Oh, that reminds me of this thing that happened to me," and they would share their own version. If he had snippets of stories that would consistently generate people giving responses like that, like, "Oh, that reminds me of this thing that happens to me," he says he knows he's got something, because he's got some connection to something that's universal. He's got some connection to something that will touch a general bias or a general experience that people have. I mean, that's what makes reading Fight Club so magical. Is it, especially when it came out, it was touching on a very, very common feeling that very many men had, but hadn't been given voice to yet. And many people have had kind of Fight Club-esque experiences. I have. And so, truly great magic, or I'm sorry, truly great art, because it is a set piece. It's not interactive in a way that like a stage magician would be, or a hypnotist that has you in their office would be interactive. It has to try to prime you based on what you already have going, and it's still priming because it's drawing your focus onto something in particular. But my Freudian slip there kind of leads to my next point, which is that truly great art, I think, does strike us like magic, because it should give a conclusion that feels both impossible and also necessary. Like it's almost fated to happen. That it like couldn't have gone any other way. And the ability to pull this off is the same principles as it is in magic. It's priming, construction, timing, simulation. you know, part of Ian's question said at the end, he said, it feels as though we need to project to feel some sort of grounding. I think what Ian is trying to describe is what Andrew Stanton, the famous film director behind like Toy Story and I think he did like Finding Nemo and Wall-E and a few others. What he called the rule of 1+1, which is you don't give the audience 2, you give them 1 and 1, and let the audience put those together and make 2 themselves in their head. You don't want to over-explain things. You want to let the audience do that work. And what what Ian is describing when he says, it feels almost as if we need to project to to feel some sort of grounding. Is we need to do that mental work to put ourselves into the film in order to bring one and one together and make two. The rule of one and one instead of two draws the audience into the movie. That's projection. You are projecting yourself into the movie. And nowhere is this done more powerfully than when a magician implies something that, like, if he primes you, you're about to see this, and then you're going to see this. You don't want to spend too much time thinking about it. You're going to see this, and then he does something that looks like that really quickly while keeping you half distracted over there. Your mind actually saw something else, but because it was primed to see him move a coin or whatever it was, you fill in the gap. That's 1 + 1. That's projecting. You are filling in something that was blurry, something that was not quite clear, with an interpretation based on what you are expecting to see, and that's where the magic happens, right? And I mean, this is literally the physiology of perception. We all have our like blind spots that our eyes are constantly moving around and filling in the gaps. That blind spot is where the magic happens. And so if you're doing a work of art and you want to pull off this experience of magic, of the impossible, it's the same principle. It comes down to what the audience is seeing and what they're not seeing, and the latter is in many ways more important than the former. Great sketch artists, great painters, you look at like Frank Frazetta, not everything is in focus. In fact, a painting that has too much of the canvas in focus will actually look less real. It'll look like a photograph rather than reality because there's no depth. It's all flat. It's all like super, super realistic, and it's all colored in. It looks exactly like a photograph, and you're like, but it looks like a photograph. Whereas a painting that has a central focal point, or maybe two focal points, but then is like less detailed in some areas and kind of fades out around the outside. That has a more lifelike quality to it. What is not seen and is not seen clearly is as important in that experience as anything else. Anyways, I'm going off a little bit on what might seem like a tangent, but it's related because the choice to not fill in those details around the outside is its own form of priming, is its own form of directing the eyes, guiding the eyes, and guiding the viewer in their focus. And that's what priming is. And what we project onto a work of art or onto a person speaking or anything else is largely based on what we're focused on. So, what percentage of what we see in art is real versus what is projection is probably impossible to fully tease apart. It's gonna vary from person to person. It's gonna vary from art piece to art piece. But for any individual person, it's a safe bet that a lot more of what you're seeing is subjective and projection than what it feels like it is. And a good work of art feels like objective reality, but is actually drawing a lot out of your own subjective experience, your own subjective associations, your projected biases and experiences. It draws all that out of you. It connects with you, but it still feels real. And so you have to be mindful. And if that art doesn't feel real, if it doesn't feel like it's objective and not just your own projections, then it probably isn't very good art. So Anyways, hope that answers the question. It's interesting food for thought. Thanks so much for the truly fantastic question. It's a really deep rabbit hole, a very, very important one for how we think and how we experience the world, and a good thing to bear in mind when you're checking your own thought processes and so forth. So, fantastic question. Thanks so much for listening, and take care.